H.D. McCarty is one of my dearest friends in the world. I've often shared that he is one of those pastors who, at a very, very important time in my life when I really needed a friend and really needed a pastor friend, H.D. McCarty was the guy who, when many others perhaps could have called and just didn't, he did. I'll never forget him for it. And I've often said that only in heaven will it really be revealed how much his ministry to my life meant and what an impact it had upon me. And I know that's a testimony that so many of you could give today. And it's always exciting everywhere I go. It doesn't have to be just in Arkansas. Anywhere in the country, you come across people who say, you know, I used to go to the University of Arkansas, and it was there I met Christ at University Baptist Church, or there I really got my life straightened out. I'd been a Christian when I went to college, but went and partied around a while, and then the Lord got a hold of me, and I got to University Baptist, and the Lord really touched my life. This church is more than just a congregation for Fayetteville. It really is a flashpoint of mission concern and for deep spiritual growth for people who literally carry that all over the world. And every church I've ever pastored, I've had deacons and Sunday school teachers whose lives were really transformed while students at the university and while members at UBC. So I just count it a great privilege to be in this pulpit and to come and share with you today. Now, some of you were in the early service, members of the choir and staff, and I just admire people who come to the early service, they hear the message there, then they come back at the 11 o'clock service and hear it again. Because sometimes people, I'm sure, are thinking, oh boy, it wasn't that good the first time. The second time, I just hope maybe it gets a little better. But anytime this situation reminds me, there's a guy running for Congress out in West Texas. And he came upon at a courthouse a hanging. And a big crowd had gathered to watch the hanging. And seeing this crowd and realizing what a golden opportunity it was, he thought, boy, if I could just take a few moments and talk to these folks, a built-in crowd. So he went up to the hangman and he said, excuse me, sir, but I'm running for Congress and I see you've got a pretty good crowd out here to watch the hanging. I wonder, do you think it'd be all right if maybe I just took a few moments before the hanging to speak to the folks? The hangman thought, well, it couldn't do much damage, and yet he thought the appropriate thing would at least ask the condemned man what he thought. So he turned to the man. By this time, he already had the noose around his neck, and he said, excuse me, sir, but this gentleman is running for Congress, and he would like to take just a few moments to speak to the crowd before the event. Would that be all right with you? The condemned man looked up and says, well, sir, if it's all the same to me, I've heard this guy speak before, and I'd appreciate it if you just go ahead and hang me first. So I tell you what, it's been an interesting experience. Being in public office, there are a lot of wonderful moments, the kind of moments when people come up and say, thank you for the stand you took, or I appreciate what I heard you say, or whatever. And that can be very, very rewarding. And yet, there's always the trap of that going to one's head. And I tell you something, I am so grateful that God knows just how to yank our chain when it's necessary and bring us back down to size so that our egos never can get too big that He can't totally end them in a heartbeat if He wants to. And let me give you an example. A couple of months ago, I was over at Mountain View in Stone County for the Ozark Folk Festival. I know many of you have been there. It's a wonderful event. It happens every spring over in Mountain View. And so I was out there in the courthouse square visiting around and talking to some folks, and I was so impressed and amazed. People would come up to me. Usually they run and hide when they see a public official there, but these folks were coming up to me and saying, hey, I appreciate you taking on the ACLU, or one thing after another. It was just very, very encouraging. Well, I saw a guy who was standing over by his pickup truck, an elderly gentleman, and I thought, I'll go say hello to him. So I walked over to him. I put out my hand and I said, good afternoon, sir. I'm Mike Huckabee. I sure hope you're going to vote for me now in this lieutenant governor's race. He looked up at me. He says, partner, you're going to get my vote because that guy down there we got now, he ain't worth the flip. So I looked around just a moment and I said, well, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate that. So it's always great to keep sense of humor. I finally decided the best thing to do in life is take God seriously, but never take oneself too seriously. Life's too short. We ought to have some fun while we're here. But in the midst of having fun, I also have to tell you that what I want to do today is to share with you a real burden of my heart. And that is a burden for our nation and for our civilization. Because I do think that there have been some rather radical changes over the past generation. I think these changes have happened so gradually that maybe we haven't seen them coming. We look at the scene today, those of us who are in the baby boom generation perhaps, who grew up in the 50s and the 60s that are often so talked about as the innocent times until the 60s really hit full-blown speed. But I think we can look back and remember there was a time when Father knew best, and now we're living in the days where Father knows nothing. He was once heralded on television sitcoms as the bastion of wisdom and ability to solve problems, and now fathers on television are ridiculed as incompetent nincompoops who can barely think their way out of what to have for dinner, much less a family crisis. We've gone from Leave It to Beaver to Beavis and Butthead. We've gone from where once we viewed Norman Rockwell paintings of vignettes of American life, now we see people who defend pornography and call it art. There was once a time when people saw homosexuality as an aberrant, abnormal lifestyle. Now it's simply viewed as an alternate lifestyle. Things have indeed changed, a radical change. How did it happen? And what must we do in response? Well, I would suggest to you today that there are some things that should get our attention. Marty read the verse of Scripture from the Psalms earlier. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Indeed, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Which also has a way of saying, it is not a very blessed nation whose God is something other than the Lord. As we as a nation have turned our backs on the God who our forefathers so unapologetically embraced as the one who endowed us with our inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we really ought to ask ourselves, are we better off as a nation now than we were a generation ago when we basically did agree upon some values that we subscribe to, at least in terms of our stards, our mores? I would suggest to you today that there are some reasons that our society has changed and that the shift has happened so starkly. And let me suggest one of them as being that we have removed all sense of moral absolutes in our society. No longer do we think that some things are right and some things are wrong. Everything now is relative. Relative to who thinks it, who believes it. And many would say no one has a right to impose his or her values upon another. But let me say to you that for about 190 years of this country's existence, we did indeed subscribe to the idea that there were moral absolutes, that certain things were right and certain things were wrong. And without those moral absolutes, our society simply cannot function as it was created to function. Several years ago, my son, who is now 17, soon to be 18, was home alone to himself while my wife, my other son, and my daughter and I had gone out to do some shopping. My oldest son at the time was 12, and he wanted to stay home. And when we got back, we realized that one of the reasons he wanted to stay home was because he wanted to surprise us with having made a cake. And that was really out of character for him because he's not one given to unselfish and generous acts for other members of his family. But we walked in and he said, Dad, I made a cake. I want you to see it. In fact, Dad, I want you to have the first piece of the cake. I was thrilled and I just was amazed, and it was a good-looking cake. I was very surprised. I thought, this kid hardly ever cooks, and look, the cake looks pretty good. I said, John Mark, I'd be delighted. He went and got a plate and a fork, came and cut a piece of the cake, put it on the plate, said, here, Dad, you be the first. Well, you know, every one of us who are parents understand that when your children do something, you know how you always try your very best to encourage them and to tell them what a nice job it is? I mean, many of you know what it's like when kids bring home things from Bible school. You're not sure what you're going to do with them. You're not even sure what it is sometimes, but you're going to really say, that's great. Well, this was what it was. And I'm thinking, I'm going to be very, very kind, and I'm just going to really gush with enthusiasm for what a good cake this is. So I put the fork down in the cake, put it up in my mouth. Despite the fact I wanted more than anything in the world to encourage that boy, I found myself involuntarily running to the trash can, spitting and gagging, and basically screaming for water, a fire extinguisher, calling 911, whatever it took. The worst thing I'd ever put in my mouth. And I thought, the boy is trying to kill me. I know what happened. His mother has told him how much life insurance I've got, And this kid thinks he and the rest of the family can be rich if they just get rid of me. That's what he's doing. He's trying to kill me. But the look in his face told me that wasn't it. And I'm reminded of the guy. I asked him one time, said, how much life insurance you got? He said, I don't have any, and I'm not going to get any. I said, well, how come? He said, because when I die, I want it to be a sad day for everybody. So, I was standing there thinking, maybe this is what I should have done. But I realized, no, my son wasn't trying to kill me. It really surprised him that the cake was so bad. I said, son, did you use a recipe for this? He said, yes, sir. Yes, sir, I did. I said, could I see it? Yes, sir. He got it. I looked at it. I said, you did exactly what it said. You followed it exactly. Yes, sir, I did. Now, Dad, there was one thing I wasn't sure about. The recipe called for a dash of salt. Dad, I didn't know what a dash meant, but I figured that a cup ought to take care of it. Hey, folks, a cow would not have licked that cake. I want you to know. I would say to you, don't try this at home. Awful. Now, why was it such a disaster? Because his intentions weren't good? No, he had wonderful intentions. Because he wasn't sincere? No, sincerity had nothing to do with it. What was wrong? He didn't have a standard for what a dash meant. He didn't understand objectively what that meant. It did not have any particular meaning. So therefore, he had to create meaning for it. I'll tell you something. When we live in a society where we no longer have objective measures against which to judge our lives, and instead everything is relative, and we make up the rules as we want to make them up as we play the game in progress, the result for a society is equal to the result for that cake. It is a disaster. Chaos is always the result when we remove standards. Imagine when you build your new building that I'm so excited about your building. It's going to be wonderful. But imagine what a disaster it would be if every single workman who comes to the job has a different understanding of what a yard, an inch, or a foot represents, and no two measures brought to this job are the same. Do you even conceive what a nightmare it would create? How difficult would it be for those of you who are stockbrokers or bankers if indeed you were to go to work tomorrow and every bank and every workstation within the individual bank had a different measure for what a dollar meant? Imagine how impossible it would be to survive if at every service station in town a gallon represented a different unit of measure. Imagine how impossible it would be for the choir to have made such beautiful music if when Mike Bedford stood here to direct this choir and the orchestra that no two people had the same standard musical scale against which to play. They all just made up whatever noise they wanted to. What a chaotic mess it would be. You see, everything in the world that has order results from there being a standard against which to work. When we, as a society, remove the idea of there being moral absolutes, and we think that everything is relative, and that we, as individuals, have the right to constantly change the rules in the middle of this game called life, we create for ourselves a disaster. I submit to you that one of the reasons that America is in such desperate trouble is because there are people who have rejected the idea of their existing moral absolutes that govern the way we are. When, as a society, we believe that things are right or wrong merely by the consent of the governed and merely by the whim of the majority, then we make a serious departure from the truth as our founding fathers understood it. In fact, imagine, if you will, how crazy it would be for us to assume today that what Adolf Hitler did to the Jews in Nazi Germany, those horrid atrocities, imagine someone defending that as being right. But my friend, if indeed consent of the governed is what makes something right or wrong, then let us not forget that he had the consent of the governed when he went into power, and he operated under the authority of the people who gave him the power to do what he started to do. I submit to you that what he did was wrong, not because we said it was wrong, but because a higher law deemed it to be wrong. A law of man? No, a law of God. A law of God that cannot be ignored, lest we collapse like a paper cup under the weight of 1,000 pounds. When man refuses to abide by a simple law, laws have to get more complex. One of the reasons we pass some 13,000 laws a year in America is because we don't obey the simple laws that should and could govern us. I spoke at governor's school just the other day, and it was an interesting encounter, a rather lively exchange for nearly 2 hours with some of the students. And one of the things that I guess was just amazing to me was how many of them would try to argue the point that no one, as they would say, and particularly they were pointing to me, had a right to say something was right or wrong. I said, that's not really our point here, but let's ask ourselves something. How in the world can we live without moral absolutes? And one young lady stood up and she says, well, just tell me an absolute. Give me an absolute. What do you mean as an example? I said, well, here's one. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There's a good law. We could all live by that. But if everybody lived by that in the simplest of terms, we would not need any other laws. We wouldn't murder anybody. We wouldn't disrespect anyone else's property. Just think about it. If we really carry that out properly and perfectly, you wouldn't need another law on the books. That'd be the only one you'd need. Now, why do we have more laws than that? Because someone comes along and doesn't think that it's really all that wrong to hit someone else in the face, or to take a gun and to shoot someone, or to go into a place of business and take the money out of the cash registers that somebody else earned and worked to have. So we have to carefully, more and thoroughly define those laws, because the general law doesn't make sense or isn't explicit enough for some, and so we get more and more and more specific. And the reason that we have to create intense levels of law is because of our disregard for the higher levels of the law. And the more laws we create, it's symptomatic of something that's wrong with us as a society, that we really fail to respect God, ourselves, and each other. Someone has said that people like me don't need to be in government. And they said, we don't need ministers in government. After all, we ought to have lawyers making the laws. I got plenty of lawyers in there. No disrespect to all the lawyers who are here. I know there were several in the first service. I'm sure there's several others here. But I've often joked that one of the differences between ministers and lawyers is that ministers take real complex truth and try to make it so simple anyone can understand it. Lawyers, on the other hand, take the simplest things and make them so doggone complicated nobody can understand it. So it shouldn't be a big deal. The fact is, when people say, well, you can't legislate morality, a young lady said that the other day, and I just challenged her. I said, wait a minute, have you ever thought about all legislation legislates morality? Now here she was repeating something someone had said to her, and she'd never really thought through the implications of her own statement. You see, when we pass a speed law that says you can only drive 55 miles an hour, we as a society have determined the morality of driving above 55. We have said it's right to drive at a certain speed, it's wrong to drive at a different speed. That's legislating morality, a standard of right and wrong. When we say that you have to pay your taxes by a certain date, we have established the morality of paying taxes. And if you violate that standard, you're breaking the law, you have committed a wrong. Now, no, we cannot legislate attitude, nor can we legislate behavior. But it is the purpose of a people governing themselves to create legislation that restrains evil and gives us a civil order and a government that enables us to be free within the boundary of that civility. Today we live in a society where many people advocate that the problems of crime and disease are the mere results of ignorance and poverty. And I hear this often. If we just had more education, and if we just had equal justice in terms of the economy and what people have, we wouldn't have crime and we would not have poverty. Sounds pretty good. And so many advocate that the way to stamp out sexually transmitted disease, teen pregnancies, murder, robbery, rape, the way to deal with all of the problems of our society is to educate people and to bring them up to economic parity with the rest of society. Now, there's a real problem when we base public policy on that premise. And the reason is because it's a faulty premise. Somebody a whole lot smarter than me, 2,000 years ago, a man named Jesus, made this statement. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 33, he said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you." Now, what things was he talking about? He was talking about the things of life, the necessities that he just mentioned, food, shelter, clothing, the basic things of life, and he said, "Seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and the things will be added." What does he mean when he says the kingdom and his righteousness? Really, you could define that and say he's talking about seek first the character of God, put that first in your life, and if you seek the character of God, his righteousness, his kingdom, the character that comes with that, the things of the world will indeed come with that. What we as a society have done is we've lied to the people and said, if you seek things, if you get your mind filled and your pockets filled, then character will follow and you won't do bad things anymore. And you won't have bad thoughts anymore. And you won't engage in bad behavior anymore. And we have crime because people don't have better information and because people don't have economic justice. So if we just give them better information, education, and if we just give them more money, then they won't do these bad things. And folks, we have tried that for a whole generation. It simply doesn't work. Because the problem is a character problem. It's a problem of the heart. And no government can fix that. The fact is, some would tell us that what we need to do is to give up on all of those moral absolutes, when in fact, it is our rejection of those moral absolutes that has brought us to the very precipice of disaster. I was speaking at a college campus a few months ago. It was not here in this city. It was in another part of the state. I walked to the room. I knew it was going to be a tough environment. I could sense it, and boy, was I ever right. And it looked like they brought in every liberal-minded thinker that had ever crossed that campus and assembled them there. It was like the red meat crowd. And I was the bleeding dinner, and it was going to be one rough afternoon. And I never will forget, one young freshman student stood up, and he said rather arrogantly, "I just want to know, who in the world do you think you are? All you want to do is to take us back to the 50s and Ozzie and Harriet." And he was advocating for homosexual marriages at the time and saying that my viewpoint was completely out of touch. I just wanted to go back to the 50s and Ozzie and Harriet. Now, have you ever been in one of those situations when you really didn't know what you were going to say, but suddenly an idea you'd never thought of before, something you'd never even imagined before, was coming out of your mouth, and it was really an answer you were glad to have? This was one of those moments that I had not thought about that. I was confronted with it. And suddenly I heard something coming out of my mouth, and I was thinking, hey, that's pretty good. I'm going to get out of the way more often. Well, when that young man said, all I wanted to do was go back to the 50s and Ozzie and Harriet, I found myself responding and saying, no, that's not at all what I would hope to do. It's not that we need to go back to the 50s and Ozzie and Harriet. It would really be better if we could go a little further back than that, maybe like Genesis 1 and Adam and Eve, to go back to the pattern that the Creator of the universe established for what it means to be family and what it means to be human. It is that rejection of absolutes that should concern us. And the reckless lifestyles that we live. The reckless lifestyles that have perverted some things that once were considered to be fairly simple. For example, today when people advocate the adoption and acceptance of homosexuality, they really are advocating something that is a perversion of marriage. Marriage where a man and a woman mate for life and reproduce and train replacements for themselves and continue the human race is completely interrupted by the idea that two men or two women mate off and marry. That's a perversion of marriage. Abortion, a major social problem in our society, is the perversion of motherhood. I think most of us understand that we grew up with the idea that one of the highest callings of a parent is to sacrifice his or her life for the sake of his offspring. I mean, I don't know too many people who as a parent would not trade places with a child in the emergency room who's suffering a broken arm, or wouldn't take the fever that the child has with the flu and take it upon himself to relieve his child. That's always considered one of those basic parental instincts. There's something tragically wrong when we've moved from a society where once a mother would lay down her life for her child to the kind of attitude where a mother would lay down her child for her own life. And that's what we have, a perversion of motherhood. The sexual generation today is a perversion of maturity. It was once thought that human sexuality, a wonderful gift from God, was to be practiced in the mature relationship of a committed marriage where people loved each other, respected each other, and responded to each other as life partners. Today it's a mere biological act between people with passion. And we've lost the maturity aspect of it. And the problem with promiscuous sexual activity is that it perverts the sense of mature relationships and responsible relationships. It's not that a bunch of us are screaming because we don't want our kids to have a good time. It's that we want our kids to know what it is to be treated as a human being with respect and with dignity, not to be treated like somebody's toy and somebody's plaything, to be trifled with and then tossed aside when someone's through with them. And the best that many people in society offer is give them a condom. Friends, think through this. What insanity it is when we accommodate the lowest level of behavior our people are capable of, rather than to try to hold high the highest level of behavior to which we should subscribe and ascribe. And that is, my dear friend, what is killing our country today, is that we have perverted even the sense of maturity. In our society today, I'm afraid that for many people, there's a sense in which religious impotence has also captured us. I fear that for many people, church has become little more than a hobby, a recreational activity, instead of a life calling to change the world. To be Christian, to be related to the person of Jesus Christ, ought to mean more than simply having another activity on the schedule, having something else to do, another place to go, more money to spend. It should mean that something consumes and so obsesses me with the reality of who Christ is, the Creator, God of the universe, embodied in man, that my whole existence is given to make sure that His message and His life is given as wide a distribution as is possible. Jesus said that we are the salt of the earth, we're the light of the world. But the truth is, if the salt stays in the shaker, it won't do much good. In the days of Jesus, salt was used as a preservative. People didn't have refrigerators and ice chests, so they had to use salt and rubbed it in the fish when it was brought out of the water to keep it from spoiling. When Jesus said, we're the salt of the earth, He's saying that we, His children, the believers, are the preservative. And a world that's spoiling is spoiling because there's no salt being applied to it. We can't blame the fish for spoiling. We have to blame the salt for staying in the shaker. Let's quit being upset at the wrong crowd. We're always upset at the folks out there, when the real people that ought to be taking it for what's going on are those of us who are the salt in the shaker, who refuse to leave the shaker and refuse to touch the fish. No wonder the fish spoil. Light in a well-lit room doesn't do nearly as much good as light in the darkness. We're the light of the world. I sometimes think of Christians like boats. Jesus said we're in the world, just not of the world. You know, boats are to be in the water, but if you fill a boat with the water, it sinks. So it's just to be in it, but not of it. A Christian's supposed to be in the world, but if you fill the Christian with the world and he becomes just like the world in behavior, attitude, thoughts, and language, then he's going to sink. He's no different. But imagine how silly it would be. I've always wanted to have, for example, I don't have a lot of ambitions in life to own personal properties, but there's one thing I'd like. Someday, I'd like to own a 19-foot Ranger bass boat with a 200-horsepower Mercury motor and a Minn Kota troller on the front. Now, I know that's being a little specific, right? But you have not because you hint not. I just feel that, you know, if you're going to covet, be specific. Why not? And someday, if I ever own one of those bass boats, I can just imagine one of you coming up to me and saying, hey, Mike, I heard you got your boat. How's it running? Running? I don't put that thing in the water. You why? Oh, I don't put it in the water. No, it's dirty in the water. Have you ever seen the scum that comes in the lakes and stuff? Man, I don't want to get my boat all dirty like that. Besides, there's stumps in the lake. You run over one of those things, knock a hole in it, messes up your boat, puts scratches on it. Not me. Not putting my boat in the water. Oh, what are you doing with your boat? Oh, listen. Hey, I've got it in a warehouse with a lot of other boats. It's a great warehouse. In fact, it's the most wonderful boat warehouse I've ever seen. And I put my boat down there, and every weekend when I get off work on Friday, I go down to the boat warehouse, and a bunch of other boat owners get down there. We all wash and wax and polish our boats, and we sit up in our boats, and we wave at each other, and we talk about boats, and we read boat books, and we have people come in who are wonderful boat speakers, and they talk about boats, and they give us talks and inspirational themes on boats, and talk about the great boaters from the past, and we sing boat songs, and I mean, it's just great. And then when the weekend is over, we all turn off the lights and lock the doors, and we have another time until next weekend. We'll get together with our boats again. You say, that's kind of nuts, isn't it, to spend that kind of money and keep your boat in a warehouse? Folks, I'll tell you something. Church isn't supposed to be a warehouse. So we come together and wave at each other and polish our Christian faith up a little bit talk about the great, great Christians of the past and the wonderful people of the Bible, make ourselves feel a little better for a weekend, and a few hours in the warehouse, sing a few songs and encourage one another, and turn off the lights and go back and being just what we were, never taking our boats out of the warehouse. A boat was made to go in the water, and when it does, it makes waves. And a Christian was made to be in the world, and when he gets there, he's going to make waves. They didn't love Jesus, won't love you either. That's part of the deal. You're going to be some scratches on you, you're going to get some holes knocked, going to be some stuff coming with you when you go through the water. It's dirty out there. Have to be cleaned up every now and then. But the fact is, the world is where it is because too many of us had rather warehouse our faith rather than launch our boats into the water of this world. As a pastor, I used to think that, the tragedy was I went into the pastorate believing that I was going to get to be the captain of a spiritual warship leading troops of God into battle. I found out that the expectation most people had of me was not to be the captain of a warship. It was to be the captain of the love boat. Not leading an army into battle, but rather making sure everybody was having a good time. Will God ever change this world if we who are His children are more interested in serving our own comfort than we are sacrificing our lives for the advancement of Jesus Christ? Is there any hope for America and the rest of this world if we are truly more interested in being served than we are in serving? A few months ago, I was in California speaking at an event for the National Day of Prayer. And while there, a gentleman came up and introduced himself. He was a sheriff in Lodi, California. He told me the story of a friend of his that really stuck with me. A gentleman by the name of David Carey, who had been a fighter pilot in Vietnam. David Carey's plane was shot down. He was taken to Hanoi, where he was a prisoner of war with 6 other Americans and held for nearly 7 years in the Hanoi Hilton. David Carey and the other prisoners of war who were with him said that they were able to survive by saying 3 words to each other, which they would say to each other as soon as they awakened in the morning, throughout the day to encourage one another, and throughout all of their existence, through the degradation, the humiliation, the starvation, the incredibly difficult treatment, all of the kind of abuses they suffered, the only way they could keep going and keep from giving up and just laying down and dying was that they continued to encourage one another with these 3 words. When I was hearing this, I was trying to imagine what words were those. I thought, well, it was probably "I love you," because that would give them a little sense of human compassion. Great words, but that wasn't it. I thought maybe it was "God is love," or "Jesus is Lord," or "God bless America." That wasn't it either. I finally said, what were those 3 words? He said, well, the 3 words were these. The 3 words were simply "return with honor." Because you see, we felt that someday our country would not forget us. They would remember us. And they would keep looking for us and go on that relentless search until they found us and rescue us and take us out of here. And we knew that someday when we had to go back and face our country, our families, our fellow officers, that the one thing we wanted to return with was our honor. And so what we purposed in our hearts and what we repeated to one another day after day after day was that no matter what, return with honor. And the day when that Air Force jet pulled up to the Clark Air Base in the Philippines and they stepped off the steps of that Air Force plane onto the tarmac and faced the crisp salute of a fellow officer, on that day they indeed could say they had returned with honor. My dear friend, I want you to know that someday our duty on this earth as Christians is going to end. Our time to be spent in this place is going to be over. And we too will be released from these bodies and this life, and will go back to our Creator and back to that place where our citizenship is ultimately held. And when we meet our Lord Jesus, I tell you what's important. It's not how much money we made. It's not how important people thought we were. It's not whether or not we were famous. What matters on that day is that we step through that gate, and it can be said of us that we returned with honor. If people have been willing to put the uniform of this country on, take bullets and bombs, and to lay down their lives to give us a country, as they so wonderfully have, then surely it's not too much for God to ask that we would lay down our lives to advance His kingdom. And that's what it means to be Christian. And hopefully it gives us a sense of citizenship that God can use to change the world.